Lately, there's been a lot of talk about how our spirituality must be all fake because it seems so arbitrary. Spiritual teachings, especially traditional ones, especially old religions, are commonly ridiculed with this notion that there is a huge arbitrary component to them, that they all say different things, which is unlike science and all the objective models, and that creates a vibe of fakeness or emptiness of spirituality. This is commonly demonstrated by the idea, a thought experiment, that if we would take our planet and reset the progress, remove all the language, all the knowledge, we would restart our journey of self-discovery, just let the humans or some other conscious beings evolve from zero, with no prior knowledge or books or tools, that in some millions of years, the scientific theories would be developed again and they would be exactly the same as we have now. There would be no arbitrary component to them, unlike the spiritual ones. We would end up describing the same physical phenomena, we would devise very similar experiments, and through that find that the carbon atom has the same number of electrons and that electromagnetic field dissipates in space with the same constant speed. But if you follow this thought experiment a bit more thoroughly, you'll see that even the spiritual teachings, the deeper truths in them, will also be the same. The name of the saints might change, the ways they teach you how to meditate might change, but the message, the deep message inside them will be the same, just like in science. First of all, why would there be even a spiritual teaching at all? It seems quite obvious to some and surprisingly hard to notice to others, but both individuals and societies always strive to create a spirituality for them, to create an understanding of the deeper purpose, beyond the atoms and neurotransmitters, that is. Every society has such a system of beliefs. From empires to small indigenous tribes, all societies have their own lore, their own system of beliefs, their own pop culture, their set of models how to operate in the world. Even today, if you dig through deep enough into some denialists, who usually claim that they don't spend any time thinking about it, you'll find out that when they do, they actually believe in something intangible like maybe simulation theory. Which, by the way, is just as unfalsifiable as your average spiritual teaching, because invoking some statistical calculation on imaginary data still doesn't make it experimental. Or something else like the world is based on randomness or chaos, which are quite specific claims, or they for some reason pretend that simply just saying that there was a big explosion that gave birth to all matter and also the time and space itself is somehow an acceptable last stop in a respectable train of thought about nature of life, that it somehow explains anything. And then the ones that claim that they have no beliefs usually have some kind of cop-out, like the physical world is so complicated and outside of our weak human minds that it's impossible to even comprehend for a human. Now, all of these might not sound like structured preachings of a career spiritual teacher, but they are nevertheless unfalsifiable beliefs about the nature of life. They are still spiritual worldviews, just not very developed ones. So every society makes a spiritual teaching. A well-developed one may contain some stories, metaphors, but also traditions or rituals or practices, mental maps. But the stories are one of the most important aspects, and they're a good illustration for how the whole thing works in general. We love stories, and we are great at telling them. Isn't it crazy? Think about this. Have you noticed how ubiquitous that is? The religions, the books, the movies, the video games, the stand-up, all the conspiracies. We constantly tell stories. It takes a lot of energy and time and quite a specific way of compressing and understanding all the data that we receive, that we see around us in the world. And yet billions of people are spending their blood sugar and brain cycles on telling stories. What, do you think this is just random? That we just do it for no reason? If there is a deeper function here, it would behoove us to figure out what the mechanism is and what it optimizes for, which stories it selects, what is a story and how is it structured anyway. And no, somehow the simple explanation of it was somehow related to evolution because there was these different tribes and the tribe that made stories, what could survive better than the other one, just doesn't explain anything to me. It just sounds like lazy thinking. Of course there's evolution and tribes, but why does the world work in this specific way that it makes evolution, survival and reproduction be based on all these amazing things that it gives to us, like connection, community, love, instead of something dumb like being based on brute force or physical size? Why is all of that even possible? So over a long enough period of time, the most well-known stories are selected and evolved using these deeper principles. A good story is then a reflection of that mechanism. It tells us more about the fundamental mechanisms of life, of people, than about what happens in the story itself. Even though every specific story is of course made up by a specific individual, the important thing is how well will that story survive, how many people will remember it, listen to it, how many likes will it get. Because whatever old spiritual tradition that you can find today, the reason you find it is because a million other stories had not survived, but this one has. This one has been remembered, filtered and amplified by the group consciousness. And so if we look at and find specific elements which get reflected over and over again, that means that we have found some underlying structure of reality, or at the very least of consciousness. Those are not rules of atoms or proteins, but nevertheless very important and existing real rules that we can then study and that we definitely need to contend ourselves with. In fact, do you ever use the word archetype? That word is a bridge into understanding what these deep, profound stories do. Archetypes are stable elements of reality and consequently of a story. They span multiple individuals, multiple societies, multiple worlds. They are structures, characters or events that are always there, the same, regardless of what history they are part of. And most importantly for us, if you would reset and redevelop the world from scratch, many of those archetypes would be just found in the new one just the same. So imagine that you would take a look at a spiritual teaching from this new reset world. First you might look at specific stories, names of gods or events, or the characters, or the cities where those characters lived. Most of them would probably be very different from existing and past traditions. Kinda just like names of physical laws like Newton, Ohm or Coulomb would be different as well. Do you think that Einstein in this new reset world would write down general relativity in those exact sentences? Or that the 156,000 words comprising the Darwin's Origin of Species would be exactly the same? There Darwin might not even be a single person, but instead of a group of collaborators. But if you look deeper at the principles, at what the Einstein's text aims to represent, at what it tells us about the world, those meanings would be the same. And just like that, in religious stories, if you look past the names of characters and ways to describe them, into those stories are meant to represent and teach, what you would find is those pesky archetypes, which are always the same, which is what the word means. And yet if you read about different ways to do spirituality, you still get this feeling of arbitrariness. It's easy to see if you look at different traditions. People say there is only one way to do relativity right and still get the GPS to work. But there are many different traditions, and Christianity says to do this, Buddhism says to do this, the tribe from Amazon says this other thing. But here is one key difference. The society which wrote down Christianity and the society that lives in the Amazon forest are very different societies. They have different lives, not because of their spirituality, but because of the social structures, because of how they get their food, because of what technology they possess, because they might have access to a birth control pill or a safe surgery, because of type of land they live on or access to natural resources or plant medicines, because of building materials. The spirituality deals primarily with how to live our lives, what to do, how to act. It doesn't tell us how to forge steel in the best way possible. In fact, that's a relatively easy task to figure out, because it's easy to test and easy to experiment. A much harder task is to synchronize all people in the same society and make them live with each other and give meaning to their lives, and even to just understand and predict them. And even though even such a simple task as forging of steel might look a bit different in different societies also, The social and interpersonal rules are much more rich and complex than that. People look up to spirituality to help them in everyday lives, to guide them. Don't you think that a person who spends their whole life hunting every week and collecting medicine plants for even just survive, living, in an endless forest, having to deal with spiders and poisonous snakes, raising children in a one-room house in the nature for all of their life, could maybe need a different guidance or lessons in life than somebody living in an industrialized society and rarely doing any physical work or worrying about food, but instead having to navigate a society of 5 million people living on the same land and raising children with help of public schools, pop culture and drugs. Spirituality gives guidance. If the society itself is different, if the challenges are different, the relationships are different, then the best possible guidance to those people will be different. And then the stories of spiritual teaching will have to be adjusted to that. And that's where the arbitrariness comes from. It doesn't make them a lie. It just simply makes them functional in the actual space and time when they are used. And it will be the same both in this one and in the reset world. But a spiritual story for the same type of society will have very similar values, and it will be the same in this and the reset world. It still won't have the same words or names, but it will have the same archetypes and metaphors, and it will give the same guidance to the people. So the core of a spiritual teaching is not more arbitrary than science. It just solves a more complex and intertwined problem that depends on the society, language, available technology, etc. It doesn't produce simply a set of stories or character names. It produces useful values and models. And those values are not arbitrary. They come from archetypes of eternal human condition that nevertheless have to be expressed for each individual society in terms that it will understand and be able to use.